that person. Thank you. And I'm going to start the video. It's about 9 minutes long, and alongside the link you had to the Harvard self-assessment, this video also frames us and gets us in the thinking space for the rest of the session. So that's sort of 9 minutes of reflection time whilst the video's on, and then over to Philippa to give us the standards. Thank you very much. Bear with me whilst I fiddle about with IT to get it going.
Welcome back to the School of Shan.
Well, is it speaking? I can't hear a word she's saying.
During my lifetime, I resisted the idea of being mistreated, pushed around because of my race, and I felt that all people should be free regardless of their color.
We are oppressed. We are exploited.
Oh, right. It's not very clear, is it?
Not only civil rights, but even human rights.
Sorry.
So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is to come together against the common enemy.
You don't believe that there is true equality yet?
It's not very clear, is it?
No, there isn't, and you know there is.
Danielle has been muted from your end now.
Danielle, you need to unmute yourself.
So I'm not sure, I didn't touch anything, so I'm not sure why that stopped. Did you get some of it and then not all of it?
It stopped after about a couple of minutes.
Bizarre.
Try again.
I'll try again because I didn't touch
It's because I muted everyone because we had some background noise on top of the video, and then you needed to unmute yourself. So shall we try again?
Yes, of course. I'll go back.
I mute everyone and Danielle will unmute herself.
Yes. Okay, am I unmuted, people? I'm going to assume I am unless people start telling me I'm not.
Yes, you are unmuted.
Thanks. You are very wonderful. I am going to reshare.
Danielle, I think we've got no sound.
Have no idea why. I'm going to abort session and I will share the link to the video with you.
Danielle, can I make a suggestion that when you're sharing your screen, there is a button which says sound, computer sound on or off. Did you put it on?
I did.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, it's fine. No. I had that lesson earlier this morning, so thank you for telling me. It would have been news. Absolutely. I'm going to abort because I don't want to run out of time, and maybe it loses a sense of its value when we stop and start it. So, Philippa, if you're ready to roll, then please do, and I'll link that video in for via Baswa, but I'll link that video in the chat for everybody to watch in their own time. Philippa, are you okay to go?
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you.
I'm hoping that you can see my screen.
Yes.
And you can hear me?
Yes.
And you can see me. Great. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Technology is always a bit of a challenge, isn't it? So it was a really powerful video I've watched. The School of Shabs. She's got her own YouTube channel, so she does a lot of weekly blogs and broadcasts around social work practice. So if any of you want to check her out, she's you just Google School of Shabs on YouTube. So I definitely recommend looking at the video that we were trying to show you today. I'm really grateful to the PAN Teaching Partnership for welcoming Social Work England today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Philippa Geddes and I am the registered social worker, and I currently work for Social Work England as the regional engagement lead for the South West. I live in North Devon, and in thinking about the topic for today, which is around embedding anti-racist practice, I think about the area that I work, which is a predominantly white area with, according to the census in 2011, only 5.1% of the population were described as BME, and I appreciate that that's a terminology that there's also a lot of discussion around, but that's the wording that's used in the census, and that 5.1% also includes white other. I grew up in the Midlands in a town called West Brom, which is where my family still live, and the population there is 34.2% of the population are residents from a different ethnic group from white British. And for a long time as a child and a young person and a young adult, I adopted very much a colourblind approach to race, believing this to be the right approach to have, not realising in doing so that I failed to see colour and understand how this denies people's experience of racism, inequality, and rejects their cultural heritage and invalidates their perspectives. In 1997, I was accepted on the MA Diploma of Social Work at Warwick University, and anti-discriminatory practice and anti-oppressive practice was integral to my social work training back in the 1990s, with Neil Thompson and Nina Dominelli, my staple go-to authors. As a social worker, I considered myself to be anti-racist and felt this was reflected in my values and approach to practice and life. In March this year, just before COVID-19 took effect, I attended the Women of World Festival in London. Whilst I was there, I went to see Layla F. Saeed speak and talk about her book, Me and White Supremacy. I was not familiar with her work, but I was in awe of Layla as a speaker, and her words led me to really challenge not only my values, but my own white privilege and white fragility in a way that I don't think I'd really questioned before. I wanted to use this opportunity before we look at the social work standards that sit around that we adhere to as social workers to really think about and reflect on my own values and my own views around anti-racism. Tosh describes white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. The use of the word white privilege when associated with the term the use of the word privilege when associated with the term white privilege is, I believe, widely misunderstood, And this was evidenced in the response to the Bernardo's blog for parents last week on racial inequality and white privilege, which I don't know if any of you read about, and ended up sparking a series of complaints from a number of Conservative MPs. They described the post as ideological dogma and divisive militancy. They clearly misunderstood what white privilege means and argued that it did great damage to the cause of the poor and marginalised, completely missing the point. White privilege is separate from and intersect with other forms of privilege or oppression. Peggy McIntosh lists 50 examples of white privilege. And these are something that I reflected on in thinking about my own white privilege. And there are lots of ways in which I hold white privilege as a white woman. I can learn about my own heritage quite easily. If I go to a library, I can pick up a book and I can learn about what my own culture and heritage. I can watch TV and films and see people like myself represented. I see people like myself represented in positions of authority, in particular in social work. I do not fear my boys being stopped and searched for their colour, and my partner being stopped in a car for his colour. This has made me really reflect on the white privilege I hold. I've also was not really familiar with the term white fragility until I heard Layla speak. White fragility is described as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. The response from the Tory MPs is an example of white fragility. The privilege of whiteness means that in my day-to-day life, I'm not impacted by the colour of my skin. And over the past year, have been reflecting more about my own value base and anti-racism, and I'm aware that I have demonstrated white fragility in the past. Conversations about race and white supremacy are often uncomfortable, and I know that there have been times when I felt defensive about impending discussions on race, as I considered myself to be anti-racist and therefore positioned myself on the side of good and felt there wasn't any more I needed to do. The desire not to be seen as racist is complicit in white fragility and has meant there are times when I fail to acknowledge my own white privilege and the role it plays in systemic racism. Whiteness is described as a politically constructed category which needs to be understood and dismantled because the system of racism so embedded within our society harms us all. It has profound implications for human psychology, an understanding of which is essential for supporting the movement of change. I recently attended a webinar put on by Tavistock and Portman National Health Trust on whiteness. Helen Jordan discussed the term whiteness and how the baby who is born pink learns to become white. It was a really powerful talk, and she talked about how many white children are socialised into whiteness and how the reality of slavery and how white people profited from it and continue to profit from it should be central to our curricula. And it made me really think about the recent events in relation to Black Lives Matter, where the statues, especially in Bristol, where Colston's statue was toppled, and the ripple effects that came about following that. The webinar was attended by over 600 delegates and reinforced to me that it should not be left to my Black and ethnically diverse colleagues to speak out about racism and to influence change. I have a responsibility to challenge racism and become an ally for the anti-racist cause. I know there is so much more I can do and need to do. So this leads me to think about how, as a social worker, I can promote an anti-racist perspective, and made me also think about how do our professional standards help to embed anti-racist practice. First of all, it makes me think about what does it mean to be regulated. And as a social worker, we're now regulated by a specialist regulator, Social Work England. Social Work England has recently celebrated its first birthday. So we've been now regulating for over a year. And our focus is on public protection and to ensure that people receive the best possible support from social workers whenever they might need it in life. We are committed to raising standards through collaboration with everyone involved in social work. The professional standards are the threshold standards necessary for safe and effective practice. They set out what a social worker in England must know, understand, and be able to do after completing their social work education and training. As social workers, we must continue to meet the professional standards to maintain our registration and use the protected title of social worker. And the standards apply to all registered social workers in all roles and settings. The professional standards are mapped against key areas of guidance to provide greater detail around common themes, and the guidance provides further explanation of the professional standards, and it makes it clear to the public, to people with lived experience of social work, employers of social workers, educators and other professionals, what can be expected of social workers when working with people. We've all just completed our renewal, or hopefully we've all completed our renewal, where we were all asked to declare that we would abide and adhere to the professional standards. So I'm hoping, therefore, that you are all now familiar with the standards that we need to adhere to. There are 6 in total, all of which have a number of statements that sit underneath them. The standards were widely consulted on prior to being launched, and in true social work style, much debate and discussion was had around the wording. As a social worker, and not because I work for Social Work England, I can honestly say that I am proud of the standards that we now have for our profession. They speak to me as a social worker and the values that I hold. Number 1, promote the rights, strengths and well-being of people, families and communities. Number 2, establish and maintain the trust and confidence of people. Be accountable for the quality of my practice and the decisions I make. Maintain my continued professional development. Act safely, respectfully and with professional integrity, and promote ethical practice and report concerns. Whilst we have all experienced the impact of the pandemic and continue to do so, the other crisis that we have continued to face is that of systemic racism. Sadly, his death wasn't the first, but the death of George Floyd and his words have proved to be a catalyst of change and have raised the profile of the Black Lives Matter movement across the world. Whilst we may be led to believe that only these horrors take place in the US, the names of Darlene Atkinson, Mark Duggan, Roger Sylvester, Smiley Coulter, Rashan Charles and Gareth Myatt remind us that this is endemic in the UK also. So in thinking about our role as social workers, how do the professional standards help us to embed anti-racist practice? This slide highlights the professional standards that promote equality, diversity and inclusion, and help remind us that as social workers, we should be promoting social justice and challenging disadvantage and discrimination. Whilst the eagle eye of you may have noticed that our standards do not explicitly use the terms anti-racism and anti-oppressive or anti-discriminatory practice, they are very clear about the need to challenge discrimination and promote social justice. As social workers, it's vital that we understand the multiple and intersecting oppressions, disadvantages that impact people, families and communities, and that we use our professional power in a positive way with our employer and other professionals to uphold the standards and decisions to challenge structures. We should be pursuing positive change, particularly with and on behalf of people of groups of people who are vulnerable or facing oppression. We engage in action and dialogue to shine a light on the structures in society that create and perpetuate injustice. Social workers embrace and promote the fundamental rights of all people. We recognise the respect and the dignity and the worth of everyone and support people to improve their life outcomes. We strive for equitable access to information, service, resources and opportunities, and wherever possible, we work towards strengthening communities, respect ethnic and cultural diversity and value difference. I just wanted to also bring attention to these standards which promote ethics. And I think this sits alongside the standards that also promote equality, diversity, inclusion. Ethics in the context of social work is about professional responsibilities and values social workers have and how they conduct themselves inside and outside the workplace. For me, that speaks to being an anti-racist practitioner. As social workers, we should respect the distinct beliefs and lifestyles of peoples, their families, communities and networks. We consider our own personal values and preferences and take measures to prevent them from impacting on our work with people. Many social workers follow ethical values and principles that guide their work. BASWA and the International Federation of Social Work both have code of ethics that social workers in England follow, but it's the professional standards that we all need to adhere to as registered social workers. Valuing the cultural needs and values is fundamental to social work practice. It's a social worker's responsibility to understand as much as possible about the cultural identities of the people, families and communities we work with, that cultural competence, which I think we'll hear more about later, and recognising the significance of culture and belief. This enables us to work with people in an appropriate way and use services or communication tools to help them explain their role and listen to people. Whilst there is still much work to be done to ensure social work profession reflects the community it serves, and Social Work England has their own work to do to ensure that our organisation is representative of the profession, social work with its values and principles of anti-racist and anti-oppressive practice is uniquely placed to lead the way in ensuring equality in all aspects of society. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Neil, are you ready to rumble?
I am, yes. How do we get the previous presentation? For, yeah, thank you. Okay, so just going to get my presentation ready.
Do use the chat to make any comments, or if you want, if you have questions from our presenters.
So, yeah, my name's Neil Sanyal. I've been a social worker for 32.5 years, nearly 33. I've been a qualified social worker since 1991, and I'll go on to talk a bit about my experiences through my presentation. I suppose my first thing I wanted to say in reaction to Philippa's comments about white privilege is the it calls to mind Amy Cooper, who in May 2020, just before George Floyd's death, called the police and said she was being threatened with being attacked by the Black American bird watching guy in Central Park, and it was only the latest of dozens of similar experiences that white women had called the police for. So I think just wanted to kind of enhance what Philippa had said. So from my perspective, I suppose equality and diversity comes from my life experience. I'm of mixed heritage. My father was emigrated to this country in the early 1950s, and I had a upbringing of in the Midlands, not far from Philippa, in fact, Leamington Spa, and in the 1970s it was full of National Front racism. Robert Ralph, for those who have been around long enough, was in the national newspapers saying he wouldn't sell his house to anyone who was black or a Paki. So that's the kind of environment I grew up in, and I had a lot of racism at school, which I won't go into any details about, but that certainly made me feel like this country was apparently only for white people. So, for example, when the West Indies came to play in 1976, I found myself supporting them rather than England. And I suppose it was when they won the one of the test matches, one of the series really, but they annihilated England, and it gave me some sense of pleasure, which is a sad thing to say, but that's how much racism had affected me by that time. So I guess you could see that when I became a social worker, fast forwarding to my late 20s, I certainly wanted to do something to correct that. And I married a Polish woman, so my children are got mixed heritage of 2 different countries apart from here. They're bilingual in Polish and English. So I suppose I've kind of lived that, not just at work, but in my life. And I've had lots of involvement from the earliest stage when I was a social worker in setting up projects in the community. And one of the things that I'll talk about later is community collaboration. So this organisation I joined way back in 1988 in Liverpool, where I just become a social worker, was white and black people together working on a project to for a mental health facility for black and minority ethnic people in Liverpool. It was the first one that was set up in the north, and I was involved in it, became on the management committee, and that was where my involvement in creating projects first started. And I also went on to be part of the National Delivering Race Equality Strategy from 2004 to 2010. And I used that experience I'd had in Liverpool. This was down in Hampshire by this time. Used that experience to help to organise a whole series of events, training sessions, and generally try to change services within mental health services in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. So we tried very hard for 6 years, and I don't think we achieved a huge amount. And part of that was because I think the local NHS trust weren't particularly interested in taking it on board. So they kind of listened and did not a lot. That's my experience of it. So there you go. That's where I come to this personally. So in terms of the presentation, so this presentation is going to be about why we need to have anti-racist practice, and then something about cultural competence. So I'll start with cultural competence, really, just as a brief kind of starter for it. So I have recently delivered Polish cultural awareness training to the AMPS in Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole. That was only a matter of 2 or 3 weeks ago. I did that first in Southampton when I was working in Hampshire. Due to my wife's being Polish, I and been there 30 times. So I collaborated with one of the people over in Southampton to do that originally. And I think it has been well received in terms of information for social workers when they're going out doing their assessments. I collaborated with a Southampton community worker to do that, as I said. I also was involved with Gypsy and Traveller cultural awareness training, because I was on the management committee and supported a project in the New Forest, which worked with Gypsies and Travellers, and they are some of the most hidden group for discrimination and oppression in our nation. So I did a series of those training sessions with the coordinator, the director of this voluntary sector organisation over those 5 years, to many audiences, many conferences, many mental health services. And that's basically kind of my experience in the last 10 years of doing this cultural competence. So I thought I'd share this quote with people. It came from a Now This online feed on my Facebook, and I get these, and they have programs over in America, and this was on democracy, but it was just because of Donald Trump stuff. I won't go into any of that, but this comment was actually in the chat, and this presenter read it out, and it really resonated with me about what we're all doing here. So the brokenness of our past is not our fault, but the healing for the future is our responsibility. And I guess what that person meant in the US context, and I think it's the same here, you know, white Americans weren't all responsible for 400 years of slavery. So you can't say it's their fault, but you can say that they should hopefully take some responsibility for trying to achieve healing for the future. And I guess that's what part of anti-racist practice can be in our country as well. So I suppose the reason why anti-racist practice is happening in this country can be summed up in that statement, really, from Professor Stuart Hall. It was back in the 90s, I think he said that. We are here because you were there. And what he's referring to is the British Empire and all the wonderful exploits they did to extract resources and used them for making Britain great, which included slavery, of course. So I think that's why. So for some people who are saying, why don't you go back to your own country? I think his point was that people were here because they were actually British citizens around the empire. So that wasn't their choice either. So I thought I'd share this with you. It's kind of a walk through, and it's taken mainly from David Olusoga, who I hope some people have seen his BBC Two programmes, and they've been very profound, I think. So yeah, Black British people have been living here since Roman times, and David Olusoga went to meet the people in the village where the first Roman from, I think, the Middle East, there was evidence of him living there on the Hadrian's Wall kind of army. So it goes back a long way, and John Blank is getting quite well known now. There's a painting of him, I think it's in Hampton Court, and he was a trumpeter for Henry VIII, and he achieved a lot of negotiation. So we're talking about 520 odd years ago there. So Mary Seacole, I think most people would have heard of her by now. She's in the national curriculum for schools, and she did the equivalent of Florence Nightingale's work in the Crimean War, but no one reported about her. So I won't go into any details about her, but you can find that out by just Googling her. Now, David Olusoga has become sort of quite a national figure now in terms of all the work he's been doing on Black British history. He's another person of mixed heritage himself, and in his very first programme he talks about his experiences in Sunderland of racism he experienced similar to me, really. So he's slightly younger than me, so but more of the same. So he's done a series of programmes about Black British history. And he pointed out several times in several documentaries that the Windrush people, which is the ones who were discriminated by the Home Office, a couple of years ago was the peak of it, and who were deported, some of them, and told they weren't British citizens. They were not the first people who arrived here of Black African and Caribbean descent. So I think that's one of the big messages I want to give people, that this isn't recent. So in Liverpool, Bristol and other British cities, hundreds of slaves served wealthy merchant families. And the newspaper notices of runaways, you can find them if you look. And there's a historian in Liverpool who I regularly get Facebook stuff on his group, and he's coming up with that about once a month, a notice saying runaway, 10 guineas reward for, and they give the first name, a Negro. So people in Liverpool claimed for decades that there were no slaves living there. Unfortunately, they were wrong. So those slaves settled, many of them, when they got their freedom, and they married white British people, and there are thousands of descendants across the country who, if they did their DNA tests and did their searching, would find that they traced their heritage back to some of those slaves and ex-slaves from the late 18th, early 19th century. So I'm just giving you a flavour of what David Olusoga had said in his programme, really. So one of the things that people may not be aware, some people might be aware of this because it did achieve some, it was more on social media and it's not been put into the national media, apart from David Olusoga. So historians at University College London, led by Professor Catherine Hall, and she was the wife of Stuart Hall, the one I quoted earlier. She and her fellow researchers went through the files, they're known as T71, in the archives in Kew, and they found 1,631 original slave owner files. And this is not just individuals, but families. In 1834, the government, in order to get rid of slavery, finally, decided they would have to compensate all the people who owned the slaves. So these owners weren't just in the big cities I mentioned before. The research by this UCL team discovered that they were living in most towns and villages all over Britain, right up to Inverness and down to Penzance. And I think that was something that really surprised me at the level of which ordinary people owned slaves. 40% of them were widows and church vicars and ministers, which gives you an idea of the level of involvement that the whole society had in that business. So John Gladstone, who was the father of William Gladstone, who most people would have known was the Prime Minister of England 4 times in the 19th century. You can't blame the son for the father's sins, but he was the biggest slave owner in Britain, 2,500 of them, mainly in Jamaica and other Caribbean islands. So in 1834, that slavery and the slave trade was finally abolished. £20 million was given to those slave owners, 46,000 of them. In today's money, that is about 17 billion. It's a lot of money. And until 2009, when Gordon Brown had to inject 175 billion into the economy, otherwise it would have collapsed. That was the biggest amount of money ever given by the government. 2 bankers, Moses Montefiore and Nathan Rothschild, lent 15 million of it to the government. So, and then those slaves themselves were never compensated. They were actually transferred into apprenticeships to work for a further 4 years for free at 45 hours. So they were really technically still slaves before they could be fully free. So how has this history I've been talking about of white British people treating Africans like non-human property for 250 years until the abolition, how did it affect the psyche of our nation? I think it's a question that people need to go away and think about. How has it embedded racial prejudice to such a deep level that many people are unaware of it? And that doesn't mean just personally, but in the psyche of the nation. So David Olusoga's, there will be in the chat links to a very good presentation he did. It's not too long and it's worth listening to. And part of that presentation, he said, "We've done so well at airbrushing slavery out of the nation's story. The proto-industrial slavery of the sugar plantations of the Caribbean made Bristol and other cities enormously wealthy. We are a big enough country, a mature enough democracy to confront all aspects of our past, not just the nice ones." At this point, I just wanted to let you know that in connection with the slavery, National Trust published a report back in the summer. They started their research into their own houses and stately homes in October 2019, and they found that 66% of them were built on the money that slave owners made. So they put this in a presentation and a report, and they put their intentions out to put signage up to tell visitors in future about it. These same MPs who you heard Philippa talk about complaining about Barnardo's also want to withdraw National Trust's government funding as a result of that. So this is what I call pushback, really. So Alcala, who I hope some people have heard of, another man with mixed heritage. He's a rapper, author, political analyst and raconteur. You can see numerous things he's done on YouTube. He referred to William Wilberforce, who I think if you asked anyone in the country, that's the person who ended slavery. And yes, he was influential in ending slavery. But in his book, which I recommend people read, because it's an autobiography as well as a description of the legacy of the British Empire, the ability for collective selective amnesia in the service of easing a nation's cognitive dissonance is nowhere better exemplified than in the manner that much of Britain has chosen to remember the transatlantic slavery, in particular the British Empire more generally. So he means, why do people remember a white man about in terms of the slave trade? I suppose that's his point, really. There were plenty of slaves and ex-slaves, lots and lots of examples I'm not going to go into today. Samuel L. Jackson has done a fantastic series of documentaries, which I think you can still get on iPlayer, all about that. Rennie Edo Lodge, yet another woman with mixed heritage, who wrote a book called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, or Racism, I think it was. A crucial book. There's an interview, linked to an interview with her where she describes her life and why she wrote the book. And she said, not all white people, just the vast majority, who refuse to accept the legitimacy of structural racism and its symptoms. I can no longer engage with the gulf of an emotional disconnect that white people display when a person of colour articulates their experience. This emotional disconnect is the conclusion of living a life oblivious to the fact that their skin colour is the norm and others deviate from it. That's linking into what Philippa had said already. So here we come to anti-racist practice and what today's all about. So I would suggest that these are some of the ways in which anti-racist practice can be followed. Collaborate with individuals with lived experience and professional diverse backgrounds, which is what I've been doing all my career. And that's about white people, white social workers and social workers from BME backgrounds and other professions and in this health and social care arena, just collaborating to try and get those needs met in the social working standards. Understand that colour blindness is not helpful because everyone's needs are not the same, and that isn't treating them equally, and that's about diversity. So if you're seeing everyone the same, then they aren't all the same, but they have got equal rights. You don't have to have detailed knowledge about every culture and religious belief, but you need to know how to access the information about the relevant cultures you come across in the communities you work amongst. So in this area, Wessex, I suppose you could give the description for in today's audience. As Philippa said, they're a very low rate of black and minority ethnic population. But as I've found in looking at some of the referrals that are coming through Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, there's a lot of people from white other backgrounds around Europe, Eastern Europe, Middle East. So they're the people who we need to look at serving in my area. And in Dorset and Wiltshire, it'll be different, potentially. Now, discover how white identity, fragility, and sometimes privilege can all contribute to perpetuating systemic and institutional racism. And when I say white identity, I'm talking about the white supremacy end of that, really. I'm talking about, which is my next point, about Brexit racism, and I'm talking about the fragileness of that. It's linked not to you as a white person per se, but that's what I mean by white identity. And Philippa did a good job of describing what white privilege could be, and I agree with her that it would be better to have a different phrase, because in America I think people understand it, but here I think it's not necessarily helpful. Understand how over the past 10 years Brexit has brought about a renewed growth in xenophobia against white citizens of other nations. That's only really been seen in the level of it in World War I and World War II. So I think certainly from my wife's experience of being a white Polish woman, walking down the streets, nothing particularly happens to her, but if she starts talking Polish to one of her friends in a shop, then that might engender some different reactions. And I think that's the minimum of what's happened to a fair amount of Eastern Europeans since June the 23rd, 2016. Next point is to understand how race, culture and diversity all have a massive effect on social work practice. So, you know, that's relating to the standards, it's self-evident. So towards the end of my slides now, how do social workers develop cultural competence? Now, I can't give you a full lesson here on how to do it. I've given my own experiences. What I will say is I'm a member of the Minority Ethnic Health email forum, which is an international and national one, and it's mainly in the health arena and doctors, nurses and health professionals. What I found from the people who are posting from the US is that their nurses and medical staff adhere to strict guidelines on cultural competence, and they sent over their policies. So I actually read some of them, and they were very precise and detailed about how they should practice with people from diverse communities and languages and cultures. And we haven't really got that. The NHS has still not got there. And it's about time, really. So the Delivering Race Equality Strategy actually had a commitment to try and deliver cultural competence. And unfortunately, it was only really delivered in a couple of pockets of the country. It never really got rolled out. And there was a lot of resistance to it within NHS trusts. So the Mental Health Act review, which was completed in November 2018, and if COVID hadn't happened, I think you probably would have seen something this year. The government's finally trying to do something about it. These are the recommendations in the report they did at the end of 2 years of asking people around the country and organisations. Development and implementation of an organisational competence framework and patient and carer experience tools. So the organisational competence framework is what we're talking about, the cultural competence. Combating the effects of unconscious bias within the mental health workforce. And the unconscious bias is in the BCP suite of training online. I'm not saying that some of this isn't already happening. The workforce needs to be more culturally reflective of the people it works with, to understand the effects of discrimination upon them and be trained to provide the best possible assessment and support. And some of that is about misdiagnosis amongst psychiatrists, which is unfortunately a big issue, especially in the metropolitan areas. But it's about all staff just getting awareness about who they're working with. That's it.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Neil.
Murray, are you ready to roll?
Yeah, just come in.
Perfect. There are lots of interesting links in the chats. If you haven't noticed, people in the session, so lots of things Neil referred to are in there. And we've got a further list of recommendations and signposting for you, which will have the full programme content. Thanks, Murray.
Can you see that?
Not yet.
Ah. Bear with me, my computer's having a...
If in doubt, use the browse function on the share. When you get share content, there's a browse button in the middle of the page towards the right, and you can find your document through that, Murray.
If you have any questions for our two presenters so far, please put them in the chat, and we're happy to try and answer them, or just any comments, really, any reflections that you have from what's been shared so far. That would be great.
That's it, Murray. Everything's okay.
Okay. Right. Thanks very much, Neil, and I hope you're all getting the gist of what we're about today, and it's really interesting to get different perspectives from different professionals in regard to this. So I just wanted to say before I start that I'm a white male, and so therefore I seek forgiveness from any black or brown people in the room today, that I'm still working through my own racist prejudice, and please bear with my efforts in addressing these. In my short presentation, I can't critique the subjects of structural racism and white privilege in any great depth, but I want to outline my understanding of our collective understanding of racism within society, and in particular in the mental health system, and my recent reflections, so that we can start the conversation in our social care system that we're all part of, and hopefully enable some of our learning. So as Neil's been suggesting, and Philippa as well, we're mainly taught to recognise that racism is individual acts of discrimination, hate or ignorance, rather than us all operating in an invisible system that confers racial dominance and privilege. So I would argue that we need to change this narrative, and from it being a problem for people of colour to being our problem, i.e. white people's problem. So that's going to be the majority of my slides. So I just want to give you a bit of background and use a case study. So I qualified in 1994. So anti-racism and anti-discriminatory practice was a very big part of my training. I'm a full-time approved mental health professional, or AMP, and my role and our team's role in Dorset is to make decisions about whether someone should be detained in hospital when we get a referral. It's a very serious role, and has the potential to deprive somebody of their liberty, obviously. So there's only 3 types of people who can deprive you of your liberty in this country. That's a police officer, a judge, or an AMP. So it's a very serious role, and it is fundamentally about individual values, judgments, dignity, diversity, understanding of legal knowledge, knowledge of mental disorder, and working in partnership. So I love my job. It's always interesting, and it's always challenging. And recently I had a case which I want to talk to you about. So this case is about a man called John, who comes from a West African country. He lives in a town in Dorset with his family, which is his brother and his brother's children. We were asked to go and assess this John, who had evidence of paranoia, delusions, and was making threats towards his family. So when myself and the 2 doctors turned up to do this assessment, we got his name wrong. I got his name wrong when he opened the door, and this upset him more than he already was probably, and caused the whole situation to get quite difficult, and we basically decided to back off and decided to come back the following day, which is what we did do. And then we got his name right this time, and he was detained under Section 2 of the Mental Health Act, which is the assessment section. Then on day 27 of the assessment, he was the psychiatrist from the psychiatric intensive care unit made an assessment for Section 3, the treatment section, and requested that we attend again. So myself and another doctor attended, and a trainee, and he continued to present with significant resistance and aggression, paranoia and delusions, and he refused to engage with us on largely. So the decision was to detain him again under Section 3. But I think it's really important that it made me start to think really seriously about the roles of people in this process, and raise some challenging issues about me in terms of being a white, a black male in a system that is dominated by other white people. Because fundamentally, there's some important questions. Was John's behaviour caused by his experience of the system, of the combative nature of it? Was his presentation evidence of a lifetime of being challenged by white authority, or of being excluded and discriminated against? Was the fact that I got his name wrong on the first meeting something that had happened to him repeatedly, and so resonated with him and caused him to get quite angry and upset, and contributed to his paranoia? And or was his presentation all about his mental disorder? And the role of the social worker, the AMP in a mental health act assessment, is to consider the social context, and the social context was evident with there was one Asian doctor, to be fair, but everybody else in the whole system was white. And why was a man whose presentation I couldn't see why he was being held in a psychiatric intensive care unit where the setting is very controlled and there are potentially dangerous people. Why was he in there when basically at the time I didn't feel it was necessary? But that's just one example of which I'm sure you all have many yourselves. And this case happened a couple of years ago, and it started to raise some serious questions and assumptions about my practice. And so one of the things about discriminatory practice, I think maybe I got wrong back along when I was trained, was that not seeing colour is not good enough. Colour blindness, as Neil has said, isn't acceptable. And Philippa as well said this. It's an example of white privilege, and now is part of my new awareness. And I agree with Neil in terms of some of the issues that are being raised by the Black Lives Matter movement around words like white privilege and that give ammunition to those who want to push back against this sort of agenda. Anyway, so what I'm primarily talking about today is white privilege. So in terms of the context of this being our problem, just bear with me. This quotation from Patricia Hill Collins is all about trying to understand that there's more things that connect us than don't, and if we recognize the connections between us, we can add dimension and depth to our stories. And intersectionality is about understanding the overlap of different social categories like race, gender, disability, and class that create layers of discrimination and oppression. So Neil's given us a really good, powerful story about the history of people of colour in Britain. So I'd only add that millions of people died and millions of pounds were made, but mainly by white Europeans. And that this narrative is this history is something that happened over there. And Neil referred to that whole notion that we've got collective amnesia, and part of that collective amnesia is because slavery, enslavement of people happened over there in the Caribbean, in North America, in South America, and it didn't happen here. But also it wasn't just people that were exploited, it was resources, and that this still affects countries in sub-Saharan Africa now, today. So you know the history of hundreds of thousands of people of colour being invited to work here after the Second World War. And I'm just highlighting the Stephen Lawrence murder as a particular point in time which made the system, the white system, kind of stand up and face up to what's been going on. And the Macpherson report, which you will all remember if you were a practitioner at that time, about the identified institutional racism, and I'll come back to that. And the Black Lives Matter movement has been a personal journey for me as well this summer. While we've been in lockdown, I've been part of a BLM group online in my community, which has been really, really fundamentally affecting change in my thinking. The Windrush scandal that Neil mentioned is a classic example of how white supremacy carries on today, and it still carries on now, where the Home Secretary still comes out with some fairly shocking comments, and I don't need to go on about that. Anyway, so how does racial disadvantage manifest itself in Britain today? This is one of the main issues I wanted to raise, is that discrimination and racism still is alive and well in this country. These statistics are quite shocking, and they come from the Equality and Human Rights Commission from 9 years ago now, so I don't think it's significantly different. 20% of Black and minority ethnic populations live in households with 60% less median income. 75% of Bangladeshi households have 60% of median income. It affects children of Black and minority ethnic communities more. Unemployment is worse. And this is a really interesting statistic about household savings, that the average white household has 221,000 in savings. And the differences with the BMA community are obvious there. And if you think about it, savings is a really big issue in terms of sustaining the social status of that family and the children of those families and all that kind of thing. And it's evident within the education system. And I'm really glad that Neil's raised the issue of gypsy and traveller communities, because I work in Dorset, and it's a big issue in Dorset, and there's casual racism that goes around the gypsy and traveller communities all the time. So children from those communities, only 1 in 6 attend 5 good grades in GCSEs. I recently did a presentation to Bournemouth University on this very subject, and it's interesting to see that 10% of Black students attend Russell Group universities, which is compared to 25% of white students. Health and social care is a big issue. BME community people report poorer general health compared to white people. And this is becoming a really big issue now in terms of maternity services, that the death rate for Black women in childbirth is 5 times higher than white women. And I know a couple of women who are maternity midwives, and this is becoming a really big issue, that for white women, the death rates in childbirth, which is a terrible tragedy anyway, is going down, whereas for Black women it's going up. Gypsy, Roma and traveller children are 3 times more likely to be taken into care. And COVID-19, we all have heard about the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on the BME community. And there's some reasons why that might be, in terms of where they work and what roles they have in life. But I saw a really interesting program on the BBC, I think, which was a Black doctor talking about her experience in COVID. And one of the really important issues was a sort of fairly basic pressure that people of colour, health professionals, felt that they had to go to work, that they were forced to go to work. And so some folks who had casual contracts and were on bank were told, if you don't come to work, we're not going to ask for you to come back. So they might go back into work when they're not fully fit, and all that kind of thing. So there's a parliamentary report which I would really highly recommend you look at, which was only produced a couple of weeks ago, which was about the current state of discrimination and racism, as far as I'm concerned, in Britain today, and that had a lot of polling of the lived experience of BMA communities. And in terms of health, there was a stat that says 75% of BME people believe their human rights are not equally protected as white people today, which is just it's a shocking statistic, really. And this is not a problem that's a generic sort of global problem for Britain as a whole. It's a problem within Dorset, and I'm going to talk a bit about that now. So this slide is taken from stop and search statistics that were produced by the government in March this year, and show the rate of stop and search of black people compared across different police regions. And the Metropolitan Police is quite high, as you can see, 51%. Dorset has the highest. It had the highest, I will repeat that, in the whole country. 62 people per 1,000 of black people were stopped by Dorset Police. 25 times more likely to be stopped than white people. And I was quite shocked by that, and I thought, oh, I know why that is. There's a big problem with county lines gangs, which I'm sure you'll have heard of, you know about. You work in areas where we're trying to deal with this issue. So I looked at different areas that might also have a county lines gangs problem, and Hampshire and Devon and Cornwall, their numbers are up there too. So how is it that our rate is so high? And basically, I can't think of any other reason apart from there's no other explanation than that there's racial profiling going on in Dorset Police, which means that any member of the black community who lives in Dorset will be living in daily fear of being stopped and searched by the police. Other stats in terms of COVID-19 has made it even worse. That in May 2020, these statistics come from that parliamentary report I mentioned. 27 people per 1,000 of the black population were being stopped and searched in May this year, which is the follow-up of enforcing the lockdown rules. And so that's 27 per 1,000 in the black community versus 6 people per 1,000 in the white community. And the same Clearview survey of BMA communities found that 85% of black people are not confident they will be treated the same as white people by the police. In the youth justice system, it's even worse. Black children are 4 times more likely to be arrested than white children, and they account for 28% of the youth prison population. That's just the context in terms of Dorset, and I'm sure that it's similar in Wiltshire. So I wanted to just talk briefly about the mental health system. I'm an AMP, so I have a good understanding of what goes on within that system. And so this is statistics in terms of being the level of detention under the Mental Health Act. So people who've been detained in hospital. So the Black Caribbean population, there's 276 per 100,000 in 2019, compared to 254 the year before. And the numbers for ethnic groups are broken down further. And the white ethnic group, and I think it's important that we consider that we are an ethnic group, the rate is only 73%, 73 people per 100,000.
Murray, can I
Go
Can
on.
I just, your stats have created a lot of conversation in the chat.
Excellent.
And we've just been asked whether Dorset Police have responded to that statistic that you quoted.
No, I don't know they have. I do know that it's worth looking up an individual called Councillor Pipe, who is a Dorset councillor from Purbeck, and the statistics were considered at a crime and justice panel in September, and he came out with some horrendous racist comment, which was reported in the Dorset Echo and the Bournemouth Echo, and he was forced to resign from the committee by the leader of Dorset Council. So it's just kind of like, pardon?
It was terrible what he said.
Yeah, yeah. I have that quote in another presentation. Sorry, I had to take some things out here, but basically, so this was a councillor, part of the system that holds the police to account, saying, yeah, well, they're I mean, I paraphrase, but basically they're black. So what did you expect? This is the shocking level of racism that exists within the system in Dorset. So, we all right to carry on? So within the mental health system, Neil's referenced the Wesley report, which was commissioned by the Theresa May government, and his report said that too often in too many areas, the experience of Black and Afro-Caribbean people is one of being excluded and detained. And in the introduction, he quoted a service user who says, for a black person, a psychiatric hospital is seen as a place where they drug you up or at worst even kill you. And this is not a new problem. The Keating report in 2007 identified that there is a genuine fear within the BME community that the mental health system could lead to their death, which is a shocking understanding of the impacts of racism on the mental health system. The Sainsbury report in 2002 talked about more children of Black people being taken into care as a result of a Mental Health Act assessment and interventions being characterised by cultural conflicts. And I just wanted to just sort of focus on that for a minute, that it's really important that we understand as white people, and I'm using that very pointedly, it's our problem and we need to deal with it. But in terms of cultural conflict within the mental health service, and I would suggest this probably applies across the board in terms of different areas of social work, that if the very concept of your identity and what you believe to be, for example, mental illness is different from the norm, i.e. the Western norm, then this is inevitably going to lead to a sort of cultural conflict within yourself and deep psychological trauma on top of what is a pre-existing trauma that's going on in terms of the racism in society. So microaggressions and institutional ignorance that leads to fear and a conflict within the presentation, so that when I, as a white social worker, white go to assess somebody, a person of colour, there's already that kind of conflict going on before we've even started the process. And this Sainsbury report identified that professionals have a fear about talking about issues of race in a safe and honest manner. And I think we all know this deep down, that we don't talk about race. We don't talk about systemic racism because we're scared to get it wrong. We're scared to say the wrong thing. And this is one of the nubs of the issue as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to just crack on. So I just wanted to address a couple of other issues in terms of concepts. So the difference between prejudice and racism. Racism is prejudice plus power. So it is very clear that Black people cannot be racist because they don't have the power. This is a fundamental issue. I think we need to recognise that the language has changed. So it's all in context of the Brexit issue that Neil mentioned previously, that cultural differences and British values and swarms and our culture being swamped, and groups like the EDL being able to identify, no, we're not racist, but we're just protecting British values. And the whole debate about 2,000 people coming across the channel in rubber dinghies is just kind of like, 2,000 people? That's tiny, isn't it? It's minuscule. It's not the biggest issue. White privilege, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but this is a really interesting quote from Renier Lodge, who said, white privilege is the preferred situation of feeling more comfortable with openly racist far-right extremists because at least you know where you stand with them. The boundaries are clear. Let's just understand that for a second, white folks in the room, that a black person might find it easier to deal with an openly racist person because they know what they're dealing with, whereas they don't know what they're dealing with the likes of us. Because we've got this white fragility, and we get offended and we get upset and we get angry when people accuse us of something, because we have this guilt thing. So just need to think on about that. Institutional racism, I hope you've all heard of it, and I think it's alive and well, unfortunately, in our organisations.
Yeah.
And unconscious bias, we've already talked about. We had one of these PELP events last year about that, and maybe the year before, and it was a really interesting day for me, because I came away fairly disappointed that I was there was a lot of my colleagues didn't really get it, but I'll leave it there. I just wanted to look at colour blindness, that this is not a benign, judgment-free issue, and some of us may have been brought up by our parents who thought, yeah, being colourblind was a good thing and we weren't going to upset anybody. But as others have said, it's a way of continuing racial dominance and social injustice. It's a way of people with white privilege pretending that their privilege is fictitious. Eddie Lodge says it's fraught with racism, racist stereotyping, and for women racialized misogyny. And just briefly, in terms of the danger of a single story, is a really fantastic TED talk that Chimamanda Adichie has done, which I'd highly recommend, where she talks about growing up in Nigeria and only reading stories and fairy tales written by British and American white writers, that she only had notions that girls with blue eyes and were the heroes of stories. And she talks about how it's really important that we have depth to our understanding of each other, of different cultural groups, because stereotypes sometimes are true, but the problem is they only present a single story, and unless you have layers and depth of each other's stories, that's where racism comes from. So just briefly, these are some of the things that I think I'm doing, and I would urge you to do yourself, which is to challenge yourself and recognize your own socialization and racism. This is not personal. This is just a fact. It's just the fact that you, like everybody else who's white in this room, grew up in a racist system, and it's not personal. And you need to just forget the guilt, and nobody's blaming you for it. But what we're trying to do is to start conversation and, as I say, negotiate shared understanding of needs and illness and solutions with your service users. Get names right. So it's not acceptable to go into an institution where the nurses or the doctors or the workers in that place, they all call him Johnny because that's what he likes, but that's not actually his name. And So I always now ask the person, what's your name, when I'm doing an assessment, and they can tell you what their name is, and you use it, and then you can tell the staff in the institution you're working in. And arranging translation services, even if you think their English is good, is a good thing, because there's lots of nuances in terms of cultural differences that you don't get when you're trying to assess somebody, especially in our world, where we're assessing for really important decisions about levels of care and types of service, and in my context, whether I'm going to detain or not. Cultural nuances are really important. And challenging authority, there's a really classic case which some of you will know about, the St George's Healthcare versus SR in '98, where this woman had preeclampsia and she didn't want to go to hospital. So the doctors and the AMP detained her to have the baby, essentially, because she refused to do that. And the judge said that we shouldn't be detaining people merely because her thinking is unusual or bizarre or irrational or even contrary to the views of the overwhelming majority. And finally, just recognizing diversity for what it actually is, which is about celebrating difference. And I've been given an example where people with physical disabilities have spent years, decades, trying to navigate their way around our system. And so hearing what their stories are in terms of how you challenge a sort of monolithic system is the same in terms of diversity for BMA communities. It's about being allies and understanding how we can help navigate the system on their behalf, and celebrating difference, which will ultimately be to everybody's benefit. So I've run over time, but I'm sorry, I'm now done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Murray. I didn't give you a countdown because it was all so
right.
interesting, and the chat group got really lively, so I thought we should just carry on. So we've got a little space for questions and comments. Louise, because I've been looking up references, I haven't picked out many of the comments. And then also Tilia was going to have a little walk through the Padlet, and then we'd have a break. So if I can leave that in the hands of Louise and Tilia, and then we'll move forward from there, and I'll just have a quick scan through the chat as well.
Yeah, shall I just introduce you quickly to the Padlet, everyone? So this is the brave new world of online engagement and having a whiteboard and sticky notes at your disposal. So let's hope this will work for you. You've been all sent a link earlier about our wonderful superwoman called Tom. She's our business support, but I've not seen Superwoman and Tom in the same room at the same time, so I'm still convinced that's her. So she sent that link to you that you can access, and it's a live Padlet. So Padlet is a bit like a big whiteboard, and I'm sharing my screen hopefully with you that you can see it.
Great.
Yes.
Does that work? Is it coming up for you guys?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So you can see here that we've put a couple of headings there where we would like to ask you what you will do to challenge and contribute to the eradication of racism within direct work with service users, within your learning and supervisory relationships, organizations and the racism within, the eradication of racism within society. And the one thing where you can be brave, because this is all anonymous, where you can name an element of your work life that you believe to be racist. So it's for us to be honest. As I said, it's anonymous. We won't be able to track this, nor will anyone else. All you need to do is click on the plus button here, and you will be able to type in there. Now you can also share links or photos or whatever, so you can be really, really creative here. We will keep this open for the break anyway, and we would really like to invite you to put things in there. If you click refresh, it will come up with comments of other people, so have a think, have a read. be enthused and be inspired by other people, start to reflect. And I'm just looking that someone put lack in there, which I'm assuming means looked after children. For the purpose of us being a multi-agency, or well, multi-agency as in social workers from all different parts within social work, would be great if we could avoid acronyms so we can make sure that everyone understands our maybe professional niche language. You will be able to put this link into your Social Work England CPD portfolio as evidence of your learning and your reflection. So just a quick link and a quick tip there. So we'll leave it open, and what I will do probably throughout the week is review this Padlet and pull out some key themes of pledges, how we want to tackle racism, how we want to embed anti-racist practice, and how we hopefully want to contribute to the eradication of racism within society. And I would seek your agreement that we could maybe put this out on the Teaching Partnership website as a pledge from this group. As I said, it's all anonymous, and I will only pull out some key themes there. So this is me. Over to you, Louise.
Over to me.
Louise, were there any questions that we want to give to Neil or Murray or Philippa? Or was it
there were a lot of
lively debate?
I think there was a lot of observations. We already sort of answered the question about Dorset Police. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of observations talking about the portrayal of characters in Disney films. People, yeah, really fascinated by the statistics. People saying that you know the importance of getting people's names right, both when you're speaking to them and in reports. And also talking about dialects, that you need to be aware of dialects, and that somebody had an issue with a translator didn't actually know the dialect of a Somali family, so that's been a problem they've come across. Just scanning through, see if there's anything further up.
Louise, can I just hop in there? I have an academic colleague in the criminology and sociology department who sits on some of the panels that looks at stop and search. That's part of her research. So I've already put on my to-do list for next week to reach out to her and find out some more in-depth information that we hopefully could share with this group, or point to some research and maybe some consideration how Dorset Police is responding to this issue.
Somebody else has made made a point and asked a question. The issues around GRT children being taken into care is fascinating. How can a corporate parent pursue the interests of a particular child while at the same time being an active part of the state apparatus that discriminates against them, and in part causes the circumstances that result in the child needing to be in care in the first place? So it's sort of a question and an observation in one, really.
The challenge of statutory social work, really, or being an employee of the status quo, which we accept is structurally racist, whilst also being a social worker who is entirely committed to anti-racist practice. I don't think anybody can answer that in the minute we've got available, but absolutely something we should all be reflecting upon on a daily basis, for sure. The struggle continues.
I think Murray was going to say something. Murray?
Yeah, thanks. I just had a wee look at the Padlet, and I spotted somebody saying that they will challenge, but they won't expect people to change overnight. And I think that's a really important issue, that we all acknowledge that this is not going to change quickly, but that we have to do as much as we can to affect little changes along the way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else?
I'm just going to have the Padlet as well and refresh that, see if there's things to
It's really busy, so lots of people are already adding in there. So as I said, we'll leave this open, not just over the break. It will stay live. So even if you think at the end of this event that you want to add something, feel free to contribute.
Yeah, do. You know, it will get taken to the teaching partnership meetings as well. So this is not going to sit in the ether doing nothing. So absolutely contribute. May I suggest that we break now? So the plan is we'll have a 10-ish minute break, and then we'll come back for a couple of more speakers individually, and then the panel session. So Padlet, during the break, after the break, when you think about it at 10 o'clock tonight, whenever. It is now 11:38, so I'm suggesting we come back at 11:50 to start, please, and thank you.
Great, thanks, Danielle.
Look at us all being back in time.
That's a fair.
Brilliant. Well, I'm really, really pleased to say that the Padlet is doing rather well. So lots of activity in there, and I'm already looking forward to unpick it and send out some themes to you and present it to our steering group next week as feedback from this group.
Thank you, Tilia. Okay, it's 11:50, so I'm going to get us going. I imagine we may have a few stragglers, so I'll speak a couple of slow sentences to let them get in. I just wanted to acknowledge at this point how incredibly grateful we are for the contributors, and actually I think we need to kind of honour and recognise that in the environment that we all live and work in, it does take a certain something to put yourself out there, particularly with the acknowledgement, the really moving acknowledgement that we've heard from the speakers so far about the reflection that they've done, the impact that that's having on the practice, and you know, feeling safe and able to share with us the acknowledgement of where things haven't gone as we might have hoped, or where our knowledge hasn't been up to it. It is a journey, and I think feeling safe and creating spaces for each other where we can feel safe to explore that journey and learn and grow is kind of the beginnings of that. So a genuine and heartfelt thank you for those who have spoken so far and those who continue to speak. And for anybody left, don't worry, I've got an eye on the time, so I'll give you a nod because we've slightly strayed, but I'm on it, don't worry. Flo, are you ready and available in the room to speak?
Hi, yes.
Hi, Flo. So for everybody else, Louise will put Flo's bio in the chat space, and you would have had it sent by email from Tom, I think, as well. So I'll hand over to Flo, and if you stray over time, don't worry, I'll stop you. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for allowing me this opportunity to speak here today. I must admit I'm really honored to be able to take part as a Black person in an event like this. It's important that we hear from Black people, their experiences matters. So I'm aware that I've just been given 10 minutes to speak, and so I'm going to start. Thank you. So discrimination and social injustice go hand in hand, and our society is full of discrimination based on sex, gender, physical or mental disability, age and religion. But discrimination based on race and ethnicity continues to be the most stubborn and most politically abused and growing culture. And many people remain extremely defensive about cultural racism and inequalities in Britain today. So we need to reject and dismantle the culture that is about racism. It can be difficult and painful, but we must try and look at racism from the perspective of others and of those that have been touched by it. They are the only people who can speak credibly about rated racism. Those who have experienced it firsthand, their experience is real and no one can take that away from them. When you are used to privilege, equality seems like a pressure. So race and discrimination is not something that was invented this year. This is something that has been happening for years, and up to now we're still talking about it. There's been reports, numerous reports that have been written and recommendations made and no actions taken. It is up to each and one of us to make sure that we are carrying forward those recommendations, and organizations don't take this as a tick box exercises. The same men that create the problem is the same men that can find the solution. all organizations should be accountable and should apply policies that work. They have a duty to foster good relations with and within the community. They have a duty to deliver inclusive and responsive services, because you know what? Ignorance is no excuse in the eyes of the law. Organizations need to be reminded that they are dealing with people's lives, and the impact of racism and discrimination can be devastating. Nobody in a modern day society needs to be suffering the humiliation of racism. So what do we do in order for us to embed anti-racial practice within the workplace? Managers need to create environments that allow individuals to challenge racism when we see it without being fearful of losing our jobs. We need to stop this silence culture, the culture of letting it go for now and speak up the minute you see racism. Keeping silent keep things the same, and nothing will change, and we'll continue with the same vicious circle. So anti-racism is about creating equal opportunity. That's all. It's about inclusion. It is about fighting what is right for all, not just the few but for everyone. It is about strengthening each other, our communities, to build a stronger nation that is not divided. It is important that we recognize that African history was interrupted by slavery, when Africans were forcibly removed and sold into slavery, with the legacy of slavery, and yet our school curriculum is not teaching the full history, but part history. So learning about Black history is a vital part of ensuring young people have a balance of understanding the achievements of Britain's past and how it has shaped our society today. It is crucial to ensure that the young people have the right tools to challenge racism in the present day society, to ensure young people have an understanding of their past and can challenge present day racism and discrimination, which are the key moments in the British history. The reality is that there's never a better time to make change. The vulnerable don't have power, and those in power are the ones with a voice that get heard. And I think a previous speaker mentioned this in their speech. So real life experience from Black workers, I have here with me some of the experience of people that I've come across within our communities and their real life experience. I have, I will use, make-up names that I have made up for the people that I've come across. So I'll use this experience for T. He says, racism today has become subtle, and sometimes you have to ask yourself whether you've been discriminated. Many years ago, racism was not even hidden. It was right in your face, so you didn't have to look for it. So it appears that the race discrimination in itself is changing and people are becoming creative with it. But however, there are so many models that we can use, and I found this one model called the CADSAM model for challenge, really helpful. And this model, it states that before challenging racism, it gives us things that we need to consider and tools that we can use. So you can start by saying, let's see if I have misunderstood you. Did you just say so and so? And sometimes you may even ask the individual to spell the word. Can you just spell that word for me? So I just want to make sure that I get you right. Understand what they mean. Understand what you mean and define what the issue is. Then you can then challenge the behavior. Mimi's experience. She says, I started a new job, which was much more challenging than my previous roles. And there was 2 of us when we started. After 2 or 3 months, I noticed my colleague was doing really well. I asked what she was doing different, and she stated that she was having some help. She told me she had a mentor and 2 supervisors supporting her. She then encouraged me to go and ask my supervisor if I could have a mentor as well. I asked my supervisor if I could also have a mentor, and I was told everyone was so busy and there was no one to support me. I struggled to a point that I considered resigning. I thought I was having a breakdown. I knew I had to do something to help myself. I used up my free time to learn the job that I could have been supported. So you see, I expected to perform at the same level as my colleague who had full support and 2 supervisors, whereas I had nothing. So I will leave you with this. Education is only good when you can use it. Now that you know, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to change? What are you going to change? Education isn't enough to address racial inequalities. Passion and commitment is also just as useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Flo. That was fabulous. Flo will be on panel, as will Nina, who I'm going to introduce now. So Nina can talk to you for a bit, and then we will all move to panel, which will be Flo, Murray, Neil, and Nina. So Nina, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I've just found the whole session really interesting and fascinating. For me, my question was anti-racist practice, and I really struggled with that because I think what we need to do is, before we go straight into anti-racist practice, we really need to stop and think, what do we mean about racism? What does that mean to us? Because we hear words like anti-oppressive practice, anti-discriminative practice, equality, diversity. And I think within all that, the whole concept of racism gets lost. And with us as practitioners and students and trainees, it's really important we have that really honest and open dialogue of what does racism actually mean before we start doing anti-racist practice. In terms of looking around the university and what we're providing, I just wanted to share a research that was done between September 2015 until February 2019 by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And they did an inquiry, and they found a quarter of minority ethnic students, including non-British white students, said they had experienced racial harassment. And out of those, 29% were Black students, 27% were Asian, and 22% were mixed and others, and 9% were white British, which means English, Welsh, or Scottish. A third of those reported incidents to the university. There were about 60,000 students nationwide. Another survey in September of that year did a survey of 141 universities and found only 920 formal complaints of racism by staff and students was recorded. And of those, 560 were made by students. The bottom line, the finding was that universities were not only out of touch with the extent that racism is occurring on the campus, but some are completely oblivious to the issue. And that's why I think it's really important we talk and discuss about what that means. And that inquiry is really funny, but it brought up a lot of debate because Andrews, professor of Black Studies in Birmingham University, sort of said in terms of that particular inquiry, The idea that you can equate the racism experienced by someone who is Black with the experience of a Welsh person at an English university demonstrates just how ignorant the report is. What it says, the report conflates racism with individual harassment and entirely minimizes the racism by including groups who do not experience racial prejudice. So that's a debate that we, I think, need to have and discuss. What do we mean by racism? In Manchester, in terms of racial profiling, recently, a student named Zach Adnan, he was stopped by the security guard because the security guard thought he looked like a drug dealer. And that's really interesting because we talk about color blindness. I grew up in Britain. I was born in Britain. And for me, the political term Black was a political term. It was about politics. It was about challenging racism. My label was Asian, so I was seen as an Asian woman. I went to Pakistan in 1989, and it was the first time I met my families. And when they asked me, I was talking about, oh yeah, but as an Asian woman, and they said, Asian, what are you on about? Asia is huge. You know, be more specific. You know, are you from Kashmir, Lahore? And it made me question my own identity. And I realized there's a distinction between when I'm walking down the streets, nobody's going to see my cultural identity. They're not going to see that my father is from Pakistan and my mum's from India. They're going to see the color of my skin. And for that, they're going to make some kind of an assumption, a discrimination or a stereotype. When I go for an interview, that color is going to make some kind of an impression. And I realized that there is a clear distinction. So when we're working with students, it's really important that we have these dialogues of what we mean by racism. What do we mean in terms of culture? We talk about the social work standards. Social Work England have come up with some really good standards where they talk about in terms of promoting the rights of others, the strength of others, talks about respect, ethnic and cultural diversity. But within that, I feel we lose the concept of racism. So what does racism mean within that? We cannot expect our trainee social workers going in when we've not had that dialogue. We cannot expect our social workers to go in and talk about social inclusion and talk about promoting the rights, because we need to be understanding whose rights are we talking about? What are the challenges? And so for me, I think those are some of the deep, meaningful, honest, open discussion we should be exploring. Even if I just look at it, even just today for our presentation that we're doing, I was just noticing and I thought, isn't it strange that we've had some amazing speakers sharing their expertise, knowledge, yes, who happen to be white. And then we've had two speakers talking about our experiences, Flo and myself, as you know, it's about our personal experiences. So if I was a Black student sitting here and observing this, what message is that giving? So it's those subtle nuances that we should be aware of. My involvement in terms of history and my history starts in terms of the 16th century, when the great British Indian companies built a relationship with India and Britain. And from there, it's become a complex. My father came to this country due to the immigration law, the complexity of that immigration law that brought this in. One of the things that I started looking at was, well, what is my history? What does it say about me? And I had to do that research myself. And I realized that there are people from South Asia background who I could see as models, as role models, who made me, and I could relate to British history, because at the end of the day, I am British. I'm a British Muslim woman. And so people like Sophia Dalip Singh, I believe, I'm a feminist. I believe in that kind of concept. But within that, when I was growing up, I felt the lack of Black voices was missing. And Princess Sophia Dalip Singh in 18th November 1910 was part of that Black Friday, and she led the 400-strong demonstration to Parliament with Emily Pankhurst. I didn't know that. I had to do that research myself. In terms of the poppy and the World War II, I didn't realize that there was Noor Inayat, a radio operator, who was captured and executed, and she was actually given the Red Cross medal. I did not know that. I did not know that Sheikh Dean Mohammed in 1822 was one of the first person to set up the first bath in Bristol. He set up the first steam bath using herbal oils. And in 1822, King George V appointed him as his own personal herbalist. This is history, just like what Florence was saying. It's not there. So we have to be very clear in terms of what is the social policies and what are the legislations? How are we understanding that? We talk about social work theories, we talk about the Kolb theory, we talk about the Gibbs theory, but we need to be able to unpick that and look at where is the Black perspective in there? How does it relate in terms of unpicking racism or getting the voice of Black people? So for me, I think this is a lovely start to start having those debates. Any questions?
Thank you, Lena. That was absolutely fantastic and a little bit on the hoof, so very much appreciated for doing that for us. There's been a lot of chat in the chat group about various things that have been said, including terminology was discussed quite significantly. So I imagine some of that will probably come up in the Padlet as well. If our panel members are ready, and Tilia, if you're still with us, we'll move on to panel now, and Tilia is going to facilitate that, and Louise and I'll keep an eye on the chat whilst that goes.
Thank you very much. So now, all of those who are on the panel, could you switch your cameras on? And I am going to unspotlight Nina, and I'm hoping and keep my fingers crossed that that may mean that those who've got the cameras on will be visible to those who are partaking from home. So for some reason, Nina is jumping back to be spotlighted. Nina, can you take your spotlight off?
I didn't put it on, so I don't know. I've still got mine on gallery.
That's it.
Lovely, that works. Now, so I'm hoping that everyone can see Murray, Neil, Flo and Nina. If I could have a thumbs up in the chat or from my...
Yeah, we're good.
Brilliant. Okay, so, and there's lots of thumbs up coming now. Fantastic. So I am going to hopefully be able to manage 4 esteemed social work colleagues in a panel discussion. We are going to look at 4 topics that have already been to some extent addressed or at least been touched on within the discussions that we've had, within the presentations that we had from the individuals. So this is all about getting somewhat depth into the discussion and hear about the different viewpoints, acknowledging that we're all coming from different cultural backgrounds, different experiences, so on and so forth. So I'm really excited about this, but I also know that being social workers, we all like to talk. So my task is to hopefully keep you in check, because 4 themes means we've got about 7.5 minutes for each. So there's my challenge accepted. So I would like to invite our esteemed panel to look at the terminology of white fragility and privilege and what it means to you and what it may mean to be a white ally. Florence, you probably want to switch off your microphone, and Nina, no, switch on your microphone, and Nina, you too. Murray and Neil, Nina and Florence, what are your reflections on white fragility and white privilege?
Could I just start by an experience I've had this summer on Facebook in one of the groups I'm in? You know, we've all heard of things like trolling and sort of people making comments from the safety of their own homes. So it was around the time, you know, in a couple of months after George Floyd's death, and there was people saying, "Oh, what's your experience of racism then?" You know, because you seem to be saying a lot about it. And I kind of said, well, actually, I prefer not to say that in this group because I'm not quite sure who else is in it. Don't know everyone in it. There's about 300 people. So then there was some more. It cranked up to the point where there were some people just, you know, showing not white supremacy, but halfway there, complete ignorance and really, you know, quite outrageous stuff. There was 2 white British women in this group who jumped straight in and really defended me up to the hilt. And I felt so relieved that someone had done that in terms of my vulnerability online. And one's got autism, who's, you know, and I've never met either of them because one lives in, you know, both live in the north, but they stepped in and helped me in that group. And I've never seen anything like it since being done because they stepped in and did it. You know, and I suppose I've got a mixed heritage, and Nina, I did say in my presentation that I'm of a mixed heritage, and my father came from India. So one of the other things I'd like to say early on in this, which isn't actually part of the categories of the panel discussion, is that there's upwards of 1 million people with mixed heritage in this country. That was the last census, and half of them are in London, and half of them are under 18. They were 10 years ago. So culture is a bit of a tricky one there. I don't want to start up too much of a tricky debate, but what culture do 1 million people with mixed heritage have, you know? So I can see in the chat that culture is very important. Of course it is. I talked about cultural competence and yes, but there are other things and we need to see it as well as, not instead of.
And Can I pull us all back to the white fragility and privilege discussion then? Now, any thoughts from the other panel members here? What does it mean to be a white ally? Murray, you've got your hand up. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not experienced enough to talk about allyship yet, so I'd rather dodge that question if that's right, Tilia. But I've done a bit of reading and thinking about white privilege and white fragility, and one of the colleagues, I think Philippa mentioned Peggy McIntosh previously. She wrote a really interesting paper in 1988, which will be on the list of resources, and she noted what Peggy McIntosh defined as white privilege, and I'll just repeat it because I wrote it down in my notes. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack, she's American, let's say rucksack, of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, tools, clothes, and blank checks that we can use at any time that we choose. And it's quite tricky, therefore, to talk about privilege in general terms to white people if they're poor and socially excluded. But I think the bottom line is that we need to come back to what fundamentally it means, and that those special privileges and those special provisions exist whether you know it or can use it yourself, and I would, yeah, so that's one of the things I wanted to say, and I've got a couple of things to say about the BLM movement, which is relevant, but not to this question necessarily.
Now,
Thanks.
Florence and Nina's got her hand up. Nina, can I come to you then?
Yes, I mean, I agree with you, Murray, in terms of that definition, but it's a complex thing. So, for example, in terms of white privilege, I'm just thinking recently in terms of COVID-19 and all the lockdown. Christmas is coming, and you know, the government has tried really hard to make sure that we do get some time with our family, because it's really important, because it's Christmas. But only a couple of months ago, we had Eid, we had Vaisakhi. And what we were told for that particular community, you know, we have to be patient, we have to be, you know, tolerant, we have to be understanding that this is COVID-19 and that we cannot mix. There were no special, you know, issues that said, right, okay, you know, we'll try to look at this. We talk about policies and procedures. Within the burial policies and procedures, during Easter time, they are closed. Now, for some religious groups, they need to bury their families within the next day. It's a religious requirement. So they are excluded. If we look around if we look at our BCP and we go in and we want to find out about different cultures, we have a list of what, you know, Asian culture is, or Pakistani culture, or an African culture. But how, you know, we don't mind, well, this is white culture. And when I do training, we don't put, well, this is white culture, because it's complex. You know, it involves, you know, identity, it involves ethnicity, and it's not very clear. Victoria Clumbe was a prime example where social workers took on the culture aspect and did not unpick that. So I agree, Murray, there are white privileges, but there's complexity around that.
And now let's move on to the next question then, which is around colour blindness. And what do you feel as a panel are the consequences of claiming to treat everyone as the same? And maybe Florence, because we didn't have the time to speak to you in the first round, is this something that you want to share some thoughts about?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think what it really means for me is, you know, treating everyone the same. We are not the same, are we? You know, the color of our skin distinguishes out of. I mean, we are different. The difference is the upbringing, the culture. And also the life experiences that we come across within society. So all those, a combination of that for us to be put in a box and say that we are one, I think for me, that just doesn't work for me. I would like to be treated as an individual.
Thank you very much. That in a way fits into one of the underlying questions that we were going to raise with you as our panel around how does it feel when your identity in a sense is denied, because well, as Nina already mentioned, that culture, ethnicity and heritage are intertwined and it's really difficult to unpick it. Any thoughts on that? Oh, I think Murray was first. It's competition time.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying, because this is not a blame game, and one of the things that I've learned over the last 6 months and for a long time, white people need to try and not feel blamed and guilt and all the rest of it. And color blindness, I think, I've read a bit about it and understand it anyway, comes from a perspective of trying to get it right as far as white parents are concerned, for example. But there's loads of evidence that children see color, and for white parents to try and pretend that color does not exist, that this boy or this girl is from a different cultural heritage, whatever, is denying a reality. And so it's really tricky to try and challenge, push back on what, let's be honest, good liberal white parents have tried over the years to teach their children not to be racist, but actually what they're doing is they're colluding with it. And so, you know, whatever role we have as professionals, let alone in our personal life, just pushing back gently on, without being rude or horrible or making the folks feel guilt or whatever, is the way we challenge it, because ultimately it's completely part of the whole notion of white fragility and white privilege. So
I'd like to bring in just one comment that I've picked up from Kim in the chat about that terminology changes all the time. And I guess I certainly was brought up with terminology of colorblindness being the right thing to do as a white cisgendered woman. And we're learning, and maybe there is a little bit of message around forgiveness and kindness, that we're trying to change the world bit by bit, but we're all learning together. And yes, that nudging and that gentle challenge may be a way forward for us as social workers, but certainly for the friends and colleagues that I have around me, when I used the wrong terminology, I was afforded with kindness and forgiveness and words that put it right. And that was really helpful for my own learning. Now, Nina, you had your hand up, so can I invite you to come in again?
Yes, I think we have to think about the gaps between personal values and professional practice. For me, as an individual, what I should define how I want to be seen, what my identity is. But if we're talking around racism, color blindness, basically what it does, it ignores the reality of systematic racism. So that's what we're looking at. So systematic racism, institutional racism, structural racism. So that's what color blindness does from a professional practice point. And in terms of our personal values, those are things that we work on. And yes, we need that kindness, because we all have some form of discrimination. It's how we put that into practice. But it's what Neil said at the beginning in terms of power. Where does that power lie? And the power lies in terms of the legislations and how the system is set up. And that system is not always favoritism or favorable in terms of looking around issues in racism.
Okay, can I bring in Neil there, who's put up his hand? I like this really well-behaved panel. Brilliant.
Well, I suppose in the colourblindness sense, I can think of one good example of this. Both Murray and I quoted Rennie Edo-Lodge, who really can recommend seeing a lot of the stuff that she's done and read her book. But why she wrote that book in the first place, the final crunch was when she was on Women's Hour as the woman of colour compared to the other three white British, all feminists, and discussing feminism. And when she made the comment, and I don't want to quote her because I don't know what she said, but the gist of it was, what about, women of colour and black and minority ethnic women? And the other three between them started saying, oh, you won't make me feel guilty about it, and they were really showing their racism straight away. And I suppose if you treat the women's issue around the world as feminism is just about women's issues, then you're going to get it wrong, as she illustrated very well in that programme. And I suppose I just wanted to give an example of it. And she's written a book and it's gone round half of, metropolitan areas of this country, certainly, and that's why she wrote it. So I just wanted to give that as an illustration, really, the complexities and the intersectionalities.
Thank you very much for that, Nia. Good point. Now we're moving on to our next big theme, and there's just a question around white fragility. Now we're going to send out our slides to participants, and Fiona, from the chat, there'll be some discussion around that within the slides, so you will also have access to all the resources. Now, can we come on to the next part of the discussion, which is around cultural competence? Now, who wants to start us off with that discussion? Cultural competence. Neil, you've still got your hand up?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I in my presentation, I already did mention how much cultural competence I've been involved in delivering from all the various aspects, and I think it's, I suppose the people who live in metropolitan areas who have got communities all around them that they could learn from, because they're just part of living around people, they possibly have more chance to do this in the sense of informal chances. People who are living in the sort of Wessex area, to bring us right down to where we are, probably have far less chances of that. And I think cultural competence, therefore, is more important to be done for people with less minority communities, for want of a better word, because there's more likely to be the colour blindness approach around, because there's less likely to be people who understand any of the issues. And so people, I think, would be grateful for that being delivered to them as soon as they could. It's the how, isn't it?
And I guess that there's that responsibility for us as social workers to be able to engage with people with any kind of assessment that we're doing, but actually getting to know them and inquire around their experience, their culture and identity, because that's essentially what, well, an assessment around risk and need should also be. And looking at, well, where does cultural competence sit within there? So any thoughts from Murray there?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really important issue, and it's all about white people doing what is described in various readings I've done, and Reniade Lodge and Layla Saad says the heavy lifting. It's white people's responsibility to do the heavy lifting. It's not the responsibility of people of colour to tell us how we should be doing this. We have to work it out and do it ourselves and be guided, obviously, but it's our responsibility. And there was a fair bit of chat in the chat before about names, and I think this is a absolutely fundamental issue, that white people, especially from the area that I work in, frequently struggle with pronouncing names. And so it's just laziness in my view, that you're not trying to get that right. And there was lots of really good points being made about just ask the person, just ask. It's not difficult. You ask. We're social workers. We ask very pointed and very personal questions all the time. That's our job. So just ask the fundamental, what's your name, and then repeat it back. And then the other thing I would argue, which is what I said in my presentation as well, and that is to tell the other people in that team what that name is. So like the receptionist. So when they phone you to say Mrs. X is in the reception, they get the name right, and the doctors get the name right, and the police get the name right. You know, all the people you say that name. And that's an evidence of cultural competence, where you're just trying to do the basics, really. And the other thing about asking, what would you prefer to be known as? What, you know, that whole thing about language, well, just ask.
Thank you, Murray, for that really point. Now, Nina, over to you. You've got your hand up, and then we may be able to squeeze in Florence for this point as well, if you're really quick.
Yeah, really can I just, you know, point out something that Neil has just said there, that, you know, for us to develop an interest, you know, it all starts in talking, and when we talk to each other and respect each other. So, I mean, ask the question, why are you doing that? Why do you do that? Well, what does it mean when you do that? You know, and that the dialogue then starts, and when the dialogue starts, then you develop an understanding. So the most of the time is the keenness to get to know each other, to have an understanding and to speak to people. So, you know, start by asking the question, why is that? Why do you do that? Or why is that important to you? And have an understanding. We would do that when we're doing an assessment within social work. Why can't we do that within ourselves, you know, and to develop an understanding?
Thank you for that, Flo. Over to Nina.
Yes, I mean, I was privileged when I was a student to meet Amrit Wilson. She was a lecturer in Leicester, and she wrote the book Finding a Voice for Asian Women in 1978. And then she rewrote it, reflecting on finding a voice in 2008. And one of the experiences she told us when we were listening to her lecture, she went to hospital and she gave birth to a baby girl. And one of the nurses turned around and said, "Oh, I'm sorry." Because she had the understanding of the culture, that within Asian culture, that, you know, having a boy is such a good thing, and, you know, a girl is not a good thing. So sometimes we can read on cultures and make assumptions within that. So it is checking with those families, what does culture means for them? Because if you came to me, I have a very complex culture. My brothers are married to British women, white British women. We celebrate Christmas, you know. My mom's from India, total different culture and language to my dad from Pakistan and Kashmir. There's a diversity of cultures. So it's not so easy to make that. So for us as social workers, we have a tool like the genome map, where we're trying to understand the family. Well, we have the cultural genome map. You know, familiarize ourselves by using those cultural genome maps. When we're looking at the econ maps, look at the cultural aspect within that econ maps. So those are some of the tools that can help us to ask those questions.
That's a really good point, Nina. Thank you. And actually, I've come across some genome maps where social workers have reflected on their own surroundings, their own upbringing, and how that would impact on their decision making and their assumptions, if they may have been brought up with color blindness, and how they could develop their cultural competencies. So it can also be a really good tool for us as social workers to look at ourselves. Now, coming on to the next question, racism versus xenophobia. And Neil, you've already touched on it a little bit. Now, I come at this with a little bit of experience that I'd like to share with the group. A lot of you already know I was born in Germany. I've been living in the UK for 15 years. And there's been what I would say institutional racism that I've experienced, because that was the word that was used when I had experienced, well, bullying, discrimination, so on and so forth. And there was an incident that occurred within my community where I live, and we've had some death threats from someone who was at the time really quite unwell, and they were classed as racially aggravated hate crime by the police. Now, when I questioned, is this really racism? Is this a racially aggravated hate crime? Because he made comments about me being German, about my family being German, about us being descendants from the Nazis, so on and so forth, where he had quite strong feelings about. But the police advised that there was no box for xenophobia to tick. It didn't exist. So it was all bundled up in racism. Now, I personally wasn't in the position to challenge that any further. I had other worries at the time, but I'll be really interested in the comments from the panel around that. How you feel xenophobia, racism, is it one of the same? Because actually the dictionary definition is very different. So racism is where you, well, have racist thoughts about someone from a different race. Xenophobia has a very different background, as in it's got nothing to do with race, but maybe coming from, and you may well be white. And Neil, I think you called it Brexit racism. So over to you, panel. What do you feel?
I mean,
go on, Neil.
My wife's the one who really put it over very well when she said that some of her friends from the Polish church, this is in the last 3 years, were taking their children to the park, you know, to the playground, and they were talking Polish to them, and they got quite a lot of abuse from other mothers, from other people in the park, because they don't like the language being spoken around them. Why aren't you speaking English? I don't know how many people would have seen in their various social media feeds. The US has anyone who speaks Spanish, and there's a massive Hispanic population. They get huge abuse. They film it from people in shops and, you know, bars and restaurants. Stop speaking Spanish. Yeah. So that I think the language issue, when there isn't a matter of that's why people of colour, in my view, can be appropriate to talk about, because in this context, it's not about the colour, it's about the language and about what that represents to the other white British people around. And they don't like having a different language spoken. And that has been the trigger from well before Brexit, the actual vote, from Nigel Farage's wonderful work in the last 10 years. And he's not the only one, but he's the one who you could say has led the biggest amount of it. So the xenophobia has been more about what Europe and European Union and what different languages around white British people in their rural areas. This is the point, because Polish people and other Eastern Europeans, they migrated to not just cities, but they went to rural countryside. This is the first migration in British history where white British people in rural areas had some other people than white British around them, and they didn't know how to cope with it. So that's, I'm just giving my illustration of what xenophobia is all about, and it's quite a distinct aspect of what this is all about. And it's another reason why I've said these are as wells, they're not instead ofs.
Thank you for your thoughts, Neil. Any thoughts from other panel members? Nina?
Yes, and I agree with you, Neil. I think xenophobia is basically a fear of strangers. That's what it says. It's a broad term that may be applied to any fear of someone who is different, you know, from the norm. So, for example, in terms of the travellers community, you know, there's you know the whole fear about and stereotype at them. Islamophobia. You know, there's a whole thing around Islamophobia and what's been going around at the world. So that's happened. One of the things about how, in terms of, we talk about xenophobia and we've talked about inclusion. So this was a big debate about, you know, we needed to do this inclusion program where some sections of the community, in particular from the Asian community, kept to themselves, kept their language, kept their culture. Well, we needed to look at the history of this, because when they first arrived in Britain and it said no pakis allowed, when they were dealing with overt racism at the time, their safe bet was to live nearby each other, to support each other. And then what happened when you got clustered of people in certain areas? So even in terms of housing and how that was done, all that stereotyped it. That then became their safe haven. And then now they are penalized because they are told it's your fault because you're not, you know, being inclusive enough. For me, that's about xenophobia as well.
You're quite right there, Nina. Thank you for your thoughts. And just from a professional experience, there are large European communities in Somerset, because they were employed directly by the food factories. and directly recruited from Portugal, Spain, and Poland in particular. So that probably links in with what both of you said, Nina and Neil, about, well, actually those areas where those migrant workers lived were referred to as ghettos by the white British population in those small rural communities. Now, Murray, you've got your hand up, and I think this is our last comment for this panel discussion.
Oh wow, no pressure then.
Absolutely.
Well, I was gonna refer to a comment that Flo made in her presentation about when you have privilege, equality feels dangerous. It feels threatening, and so in terms of that whole notion of what we as white people need to do about it, and what people of color's experience is, it's all threatening and it's all really difficult, and we just have to try and be a bit more subtle sometimes in terms of challenging people. But the notion that you have something to give up is really difficult for white people to understand. And in relation to Neil's comment about language, in the United States, it's a fundamental issue because Spanish will be the majority language within 10 years. And that's what they fear. That's what white folks fear in America is, oh my God, English is no longer going to be the #1 language. And yeah, there's a whole anti-Spanish language movement in the United States, and it's the same here, which is it is all about your experience as white Europeans in terms of not being allowed to express your cultural identity. I hope I made some point there, but
you did.
I don't know if Flo wanted to come back on that. Just
yeah, Flo, last final words. Over to you.
I was thinking along the lines of, Neil is saying that what black people, people don't want to talk about discrimination and that it's painful, and yes, it is painful, but both parties have got a part to play, and I say to black people that speaking up and standing up for yourself is one thing. And when we talk, in my presentation, I talk about having passion as well. So a combination of that helps in a way that we would be able to challenge. We have so many resources around us. So if you feel that as a black person, you're not good in a certain area, there's so many resources around us that we can use those resources, use that support. Even if you see somebody who is willing to support you in whatever journey that you want to take, use that support within the workplace, within the community, wherever. It doesn't matter where it's coming from, as long as it's being used for the positive. So we need to stop expecting things to be done for us and actually get up and actually do some work, get involved, ask your organization why we are not doing this, and and what can you do. You're not expected to do it on your own. The idea is you start something and then you get the support that is available. So I think this is, we get scared, I think, as black people, or that I can't start this, I can never do this by myself. Yes, we can. We have so many resources. Let's use the resources that are around us.
Thank you very much. So passion, commitment, kindness, and maybe a little bit of forgiveness if and when we make mistakes, because we're all human, is what I would like to take away from this panel discussion. Thank you all very, very much for your insights, your thoughts and reflections. And I hand over to, I think it's back to Danielle.
I was just gathering my breath and my thoughts after that impassioned panel. And I'm a bit overly emotional, am I? So I was getting a bit teary throughout some of that because I do that. I think it's my age. Ignore me. So I wondered if Philippa wanted to come back just to close us off. I'll do the round again of amazing contributions. Really thankful that people gave up their time. I think my little nod for organisations across the piece is that there's you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years worth of work to be done at fast and urgent pace, and potentially we need to consider that that needs to be resourced financially, because that, you know, there's only so much kindness that we can continue to in effect demand of people. Nobody's necessarily getting paid to be here to do the work before or after, and I think as organisations, for me, that I would give that a poke that needs to be changed. If we want the voice and expertise of lived experience, then we should jolly well start paying for it and valuing it in the same way that we value other who have always had the resource. So that's my little goodbye. It's been quite difficult for me not saying very much in anything, really. If I hand over to Philippa to close off for us. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I won't be back. Philippa, you're in your own time.
Hi everyone. I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody and to the PAN Partnership for organising today's session. I think, you know, we can all agree that it's been immensely thought-provoking. You know, I've been reflecting as I've been listening to all the speakers in their challenge and their contribution, and I think it's really important that we have these spaces to share our thoughts and feelings and to kind of continue to challenge each other. We're a profession that is about challenge, and it's really important, if we think back, taking us back to those professional standards and how we have to adhere to them in terms of thinking about how we value diversity, we value difference, but we should also be challenging that discrimination and promoting that social justice. I think there's still a huge amount of work to do, and it's been really important that I've been here as an individual, as a social worker, but also on behalf of Social Work England. One of my colleagues, Amina Akhtar, is also here. She's been quite active in the chat, and she sits on the Equality, Diversity, Inclusion Steering Group at Social Work England. We know that Social Work England itself as an organisation has got further work to do to make sure that the message around anti-racist practice is absolutely embedded. I've been really heartened to see groups of students that are really kind of driving forward the change that needs to happen in the sector, looking at decolonisation of the curricula and challenging that we still refer to very kind of European white British or white European models of practice. A lot of our research is white British, white European, and we absolutely have got so much more to do. But I think one of our starting points for all of us is to really think about some of this. Have been really good kind of simple kind of practice-based things that we can do. You know, I've really taken away today, you know, just that simple thing about not making assumptions, asking people what they want to be called, also asking people, you know, how do they want to be defined, because we know the language is very complex and people have different opinions about language and how they want to be identified. So where I think it's really important that we understand the political drive around terminology, but also we have respect for individuals. And I think this is a starting point for conversations. And I think, you know, please, as your representative for the Southwest from the regulator, I absolutely would welcome you to kind of contact me and have conversations with me. We want to make sure that the regulator is making changes and challenge. We know there's concerns around maybe overrepresentation of people of colour, perhaps in fitness to practice and very different areas. So they're all things that we're looking at, and Amina is driving with the EDI steering group. So please, I would encourage you, you've met me now, I'm open to conversations. My details are on there, so we want to hear from you, because as the regulator, we want to make sure that actually we are rooting out racism and it's not tolerated in the profession. So thank you very much, everybody, and take care.
Thank you.
So I said I wouldn't be back, but you know, just in case anybody from the panel or anybody wanted to say anything, we have a couple of minutes left. Or for those of you who have joined us, if you have not contributed to the Padlet yet, you have 5 minutes before we were due to close. So we're that organised as social workers that you can do that portion, or maybe start writing up your CPD log for attending the event. But if there's anybody who has the mic that wants to say anything, Neil looks like, yeah, go for it there.
Well, the thing I wanted to suggest is that this has gone so well. I see from all the comments from people in the chat, it'd be great to roll out something along these lines, or for staff within the councils that we work in who aren't such practitioners. And one of my colleagues in our team, who's the administrator, was very frustrated not to be able to be with us today. And I think it's just be a thought for the future that we need to spread it wider at some stage.
Yeah, no, from a BCP perspective, from adults, certainly with the person with the professional agenda, learning and development role, yes, absolutely, it is going wider. This is the start of, not a one-off. So no. Yes, agreed. Thank you. Any more, or shall we all just wave wildly and depart and do our own reflections? Can't see anybody wanting. Oh,
Delia.
Time to wave. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Well done, everyone. Brilliant contributions from everybody. Thank you.
Take care.
See you all soon.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Can't leave it.
Hi, Thompson.